So we're here today with Sidney Zoltak, a longtime resident of Côte Saint-Luc since 1973 and a child survivor of the Holocaust. And he's here today to tell us his story.
As Michel said, my name is Sidney Zoltak. I was born in eastern Poland, or northeast, halfway between the cities of Warsaw and Białystok. In July 1931. I lived with my parents in the center of town, where my parents had a business, a store of clothing that he sold to the locals and others. We lived in our own home. It was actually owned by my grandfather. And with us lived also my paternal grandmother, my parents and I. My life as a kid was very good because I was spoiled by my grandparents and my uncles and aunts around me. And we were not rich, but we had enough of everything. In addition to living near the city, capital city of Warsaw, I also visited that city quite often before the war. I went to a Hebrew Talmud school, private school, until the war broke out and that school was closed. And I had my friends, my classmates, and so on and so forth. And because we were in the center of town, we didn't miss anything of what was happening there. When the war broke out on September 1939, naturally, we had to leave our town temporarily because German planes would come and throw down some bombs, and some of the houses caught fire. And for us children to see fire, we always imagined that this is our house that is being burned. But nothing happened to our house, and we were able to get back to the house as soon as it got a little bit more civilized. I continued living in my house with my parents until first the German and then the Soviets came into our town. When the Soviets came into our town, and that was according to an agreement that the Soviet Union and Germany had. So instead of going to a Hebrew school, the Hebrew school was closed by the Soviets because our part of Poland fell into the section that it was going to be occupied by the Soviet Union. But we still lived in our house, and I still went to school with my friends. And instead of going to a Hebrew school, I was going to a Jewish school, or I would say where we learned Yiddish instead of Hebrew. The Soviet way. And actually we learned all the benefits of what communism would do for everybody. And I was still a kid. I was still 8, 9, 10. Until the Germans decided that they don't like the peace that they have between the Soviets. They want to occupy the whole country. When Germany invaded Russian-occupied Poland and were in our town almost immediately. They closed the doors for Jewish children to any kind of learning. So our school was closed, and it was no more a Jewish school. There was no school. So we did not have any education, or I should say formal education, but we tried to learn as much as we could from books, and some of the teachers that remained, who are now without any kind of work, without any kind of job. The ghetto was created in 1942.
How many Jews were there in your town?
My town had a population of about 14,000 people. 70%, I should say 50% were Jews. So we consider that the town of Siemiatycze, where I was born and lived, had a Jewish community of 7,000. And when the ghetto was created, naturally, they brought us in to the poorest section of town, and then we had to get out of our houses and actually lived in huts, more than a house. And we had to share that hut with 4 to 5 other families. But I still had my parents with me and my grandparents, and I was able to do that without going to school, without anything else, under the German occupation.
So how did you get out of the ghetto?
Well, the ghetto was a holding convenience for the Germans, that they would know exactly if they needed Jews to know where to find them and get them. So the ghetto was established in July of 1942, and we had to share the hut now in the poor section of town with a number of other families. My mother was taken for some work on the fields, and my father had a very difficult job because he was part of a group of Jews who were taken to the border where they had to clean the bunkers that were prepared by the Soviets and clean them out, clean the burned bodies of the Soviet soldiers and others that they caused. We were not able to exchange valuable things with the local population for food supplies. But my mother, because she was born in a village where my grandparents lived, her Polish was perfect, and she was still able to get around where most of the time we did not go hungry. We didn't have the kind of food and the abundance of it as much as we had before, but it was livable. Some of the males in our town were taking to hard labor jobs, and sometimes they came back and sometimes they did not. As I said, my father had a job, and I guess it must have been an important job because they kept him cleaning those bunkers for many, many months after. Well, after the ghetto was formed in July 1942, we had a curfew. We could not go outside our houses. And we children, most of the time, had to sort of hide, because any time that the Germans saw some Jewish children, they would send the dogs after them. So the danger to be exposed to the German soldier or people of the administration was very, very dangerous. And we stayed that way for a little while. When the ghetto was formed, it was with the intention of creating a holding place for the Germans to know where the Jews are. And as difficult as it was to live with 4 other families in one little hut instead of a house, and it wasn't a familiar place, there were no real deportations as such. They would take away some Jews, take them wherever, and most of the time they never returned. At the end of the summer, 1942, the Germans were in full control, and many of the Jews were put into slave labor camps or units where they had to work. When the Germans were ready, and their plan was to take out all the Jews, put them on cattle cars, and take them to the death camp of Treblinka, another concentration camp. But when the Germans decided that it was time for them to liquidate the ghetto, as many other ghettos were liquidated at the same time. They decided that that's the time to take all the Jews and take them on cattle cars to Treblinka. My parents found out, first by rumors, but then it was the real thing, because the Germans have hired local Polish community people to prepare their horse and buggies, because the ghetto was about 7 kilometers away from the center of town, so they needed transportation even for those, particularly the ones that could not move around, to get them to the liquidation place faster rather than slow. So my father, in the meantime, got a job working in the ghetto fence to do any repairs. So he had all the tools, including the wire cutters. So once the Germans have asked the Poles to bring the buggies to the city, to the town, that was one of the signs that the end was here. During the night, my parents didn't let us go to sleep. We were dressed, fully dressed, because it was winter. It was already November. And it was too cold to walk around the way we walked around in the month of June or July, that if the time comes, we're going to run. We actually didn't know where we were going to run, but we knew that if we stayed there, our end would be there. So a day before, these signs were very evident in the town, and a lot of local Poles were there with their buggies and horses. And so in the middle of the night of November the 2nd, they came and knocked on our door. And at that time, my father took out the wire cutters from his toolbox. He brought us to the fence, and he started making these openings for people to get out and run. I was dressed, my mother was dressed, my father put on whatever he could. And during the night of November the 2nd, 1942, the liquidation of the ghetto of my community began. It took 1 week for the people from the former ghetto were put on cattle cars and transported to the death camp of Treblinka. There are a number of my townspeople who survived. survived after they jumped the train that was taking them to Treblinka. And like we had a plan, that is, my parents had a plan, that we're going to go and try to find a place where to hide.
How many of the people, the 7,000 Jews, survived?
At the end?
Yeah.
70.
70. 70 of the 7,000.
That's right.
Not a lot.
That was the normal percentage of survivors who remained under German occupation when the ghetto was liquidated. And so they came and put everybody in cattle cars, and within 1 week they brought them to Treblinka, and maybe it took them another couple of weeks before they were all sent to the gas chamber.
And your family was on the run. Who is that? Who are the members of your family on the run? Your parents, you, who else?
So it was my parents, my maternal grandmother, some of the older ones started walking, and we, the young ones, were running. Eventually, we got to a forest. And in the forest, we were able to hide, because Poland had a lot of forests where there was enough room to hide and not be seen.
How long did you hide for?
Well, I was there for 1 week. I found my father found me, I should say, about a week later. My aunt, uncle, and cousin ran away at the same time as I did, because she also was running at the same time, and I grabbed her hand and pulled her so we can run faster. Well, we all made it to the forest. And in the forest, my aunt and my mother, to follow the plan that they had, they were going to walk to the area where they were born, in the village, which was about 20 kilometers away, and find people that they knew, and even some schoolmates and classmates that they were friendly with. And eventually, we stayed there for about a week before we realized that we have to move from there too. When we started moving, my grandmother, they thought that she was dead because she was wounded. They left her lying. She picked herself up and she walked also into that direction where the people knew my family. And we finally, when we got together, we were able to separate. And my parents and I in one group, my grandmother and my aunt and uncle in another group, and whoever else was alive. They started walking towards the village that they were born in to find people who was going to take us in and give us some shelter. And we finally went to the area where my mother and my aunt had classmates that they went to school together. They started looking for a place where to hide or someone to shelter them. And the truth is that Germany has proclaimed a law that any Pole who was hiding a Jew would also be killed as well. So it was very, very dangerous for a Pole to risk the life, his life, and the life of his family in order to help Jews. So most of the time, it's complete strangers that volunteer to do that. Very often, after that, and that was in my mind all the time, I was wondering what was my state of mind at the time when I ran away from the ghetto. It was pitch black, cold, eventually also hungry, without knowing where we're going and what we're doing. My aunt wrote a little book of our experience, a little bit. And when I read that book, told me the story. And the story was that her nephew was with them, like me, but I also ran away, and I got to the forest. That he was trembling from the cold and fear. I was both cold and scared. And I was no hero.
I understand that you were in the forest for 7 months before getting anybody to hide you. Where did you live in the forest for 7 months?
You don't call that living. You call it staying away from the Germans. We were suddenly able to find some help. And my mother gave away a lot of valuables to some of their friends. And when she came to get it back, sometimes they were returned and sometimes they said, no, we don't want to give it to you because the Germans are going to take it away from you anyways. So it was very, very difficult without any kind of
money or valuables.
Valuables sometimes more precious than money, because money was not a big. But they had a lot of valuables that they gave away, silverware and other stuff and all that. So I remember once getting in to a house, very small house. And my mother was the one who went the first, because she was the spokesperson. And she told them who she was. And they said, well, you see, we don't have much room here. but you can stay for a few days. We stayed there for a few days, and I remember vividly, because certain things you remember better than others. And I remember being taken in by a Polish family. I think there were only 3 or 4 people. And in the morning, they got up, they gave us what they had. So we had some nourishment, know that. But I remember that my mother asked me to take off my shirt. And my shirt was full of lice. And she naturally cleaned the lice off the shirt. I don't think that she even had time to wash it or anything. We put it back on, and we went to the next place. And I remember my mother saying that, listen, son, if a German bullet is not going to hit us, the lice are not going to kill us. We're going to survive the lice. And so, I never dealt with lice before because our house was very clean and proper and all that. However, that was also an introduction to conditions of what was acceptable and what was saying like, well, I can't do that. We did everything in order to survive another day. And the other day was, we stayed there only for maybe 2-3 days because there really wasn't any room where to stay there.
So eventually, after the 7 months in the forest, there was a man by the name of a shepherd boy, or?
Yeah, well, that was actually 6 months after our first escape. We were able to stay, and were hidden by a Polish family who naturally wanted our valuables. So my mother gave him everything that she could in order for us to be able to live another few weeks or another month. Then we found ourselves at a time that I would say was 6 months later. Also in the fall of 1943. That we were able to find a place where they kept us for a few weeks. From there we found another place that we could stay a few nights. And sometimes we would find a barn open, and we went in there to hide without the farmer knowing that there are Jews hiding in his place. We tried to do everything, and I think the key is we did everything that we could in order to live another day. And we were not planning for eternity. we were not planning to get a place that's going to keep us and hide us until the end of the war. So 1 year, we did just that. Then we found ourselves without a place. As I said before, it was very dangerous for the Poles, for the Christians to hide Jews, because that was punishable by death from the German occupational forces. So until the spring of 1943, actually it was still winter, my parents and I were sheltered by a forest near the house of, didn't even know them, a Christian family. And my father was sort of keeping an eye, watching out if there are not any kind of people who were looking for us to kill us. He met a shepherd boy that was watching his cattle. I think he only had 2 cattle. Not many cattle, but that's what his job. He spoke to him and he asked him to see if his family would help us. That shepherd boy went back home and spoke to his family to find out whether they were in agreement to do that, because it had to be a family decision. And they said, well, we'll see what we can do to help you. So they brought us to his barn, and he gave us a place where to hide behind some pile of corn or wheat. But when the shepherd boy came back from his family, he was with his older sister. And his older sister recognized my mother, that she served her in the store, and she was very kind to her. She gave her a coat without being fully paid for. So she remembered that kindness, said, let's see what I can do to help that family. So that woman, Stasha, she told her brothers that she would like to help us. So we started hiding in that place. And in that place, on top of the barn, where we put some hay and straw and wheat and corn, whatever else, to hide us from anybody seeing us outside. We had 5 different hiding places. Every time we used to change the place to make sure that maybe somebody saw us and would alert the Germans. And we kept moving around from one place to the other in order to be able, there again, to live another day. So we moved around in the same farm almost 12 months and we had many different hiding places. And the last one was an underground bunker that they built to keep us there. And we stayed there for another 6 months. And together we were at that farm. I guess it would be for 11 months. At that time, we were 7 of us. My uncle and his friends joined us because they didn't have a place where to stay. And it was my parents and I. And we stayed there another 7 months. And the end of that time, it was spring. Spring of 1943.
What happened? How did the war was not over for a long time after that? Still.
Well, after the other 7 months, we were able to see a little daylight. The daylight that we saw was going out in the evening for some fresh air. We would watch the sky. And if it was more bright than the day before, we realized that the front was getting closer. And the front getting closer to us was liberation was closer. So we stayed another 12 months in the bunker that we didn't see daylight because they would only let us out in the evening to get some fresh air, nothing more. But we were safe.
Did your family ever let themselves get a little bit of hope that it might actually be over soon?
Well, you're asking whether we had some news about the war, actual battleground. That was the best kind of sign when we saw the sky brighter. We saw that the front was getting closer. And it's getting closer, the front meant that the Soviets were on the other side. And they moved slowly, but it took them a little while before we started to get hope. Now, first of all, anybody having a radio is and was caught was the end of his life. So radios were not allowed to have, except that the farmers knew where the front was, and we used to get an update on how closer we are. So first we were 2 kilometers away, then we were 3, and then we were 4. Until the fall of 1943. Actually, my uncle was the one who used to determine how far the front was away from us by looking at the sky. realized we were very, very close, but the German soldiers were above us. So it was not safe yet. And there was once, about 12 months after we were in that concrete bunker, my uncle heard Russian spoken outside. So he forced the opening of our hiding place, and we came out, and that's when he spoke to Russian soldiers, and we were able to go with them away from the front and get some distance from the Germans. And this, we consider, was July. We were actually liberated in July of that year. And my mother continued to have a relationship with the oldest daughter. And when we got to a place, actually first to Italy and then to Canada, she was able to write to them. You didn't need an address, just a name would get to them. And so the contact was formed and continued until the end. And I guess maybe this, and my son Larry wanted to have a photo like that and show that our appreciation of the family that risked their lives in order to hide us. The one who was honored as righteous, the shepherd boy, is no longer alive. Neither is his father, and neither is the sister. But we kept contact with them, and even today we consider ourselves as one family. And if not for them to give us that bit of room and time, I don't think we would have survived.
So what's your message to people today? What can we learn?
Well, my message to them is, I would say, the most important message would be eliminate any kind of hate. Hate should not be part of our lives. If you eliminate hate, you eliminate anti-Semitism, racism, any kind of isms that is hateful. And when I speak to mostly school kids, I tell them that we've done our part, you have to do yours by telling our story and making sure that you do anything that you can in order to eliminate hate.